exciting to have us all in the same room to be speaking about this. And I want to say hello to everyone online as well, for those gathered who are really up for being a part of the life of Saint Augustine's. I also do want to welcome people who are here, not only just for the dedications, but also for people who are just visiting with us today. Because what's so exciting about Saint Augustine's is you can kind of get a bit of a feel for what's happening here. And it's just wonderful to have you in the room. We often have people come and visit. And if that's you, if you're just curious about faith, you're more than welcome to be here. We love people who are just in the room, who are interested. And for those who have been a part of St. Augustine's for the last 10 minutes or the last 10 years, we haven't been going for 10 years, but you get the idea. I just want to say thank you so much for all the life and energy that you've poured into this place. And what's so important about today is we actually stand at quite an important hinge point, and I'm glad you're all in the room because we need to be talking about these kinds of things. So thank you for being here. We've got some really interesting and exciting things to be talking through today. And I do want to say that if you were a part of the crew that just began St. Augustine's about 7 years ago, you'd recognize that actually what we've got here today is completely different from where we started about 7 years ago. We gathered at our first kind of place of gathering was in a school hall in a school that was organized by Graham Cameron, who's down the back there. We kind of gathered there. There was 37 of us, and then we began our first services at a little church called St. Columba Grey Lynn. And what was so interesting about that little church is that we were looking for a place to gather, and then one of part of the team, they saw a sign on the front of the church that said, "Save our church." So we thought, gosh, they'll certainly let us in. And so we began our first services there. We used to gather in the afternoon. It was pizza and wine, and it was a really great time. But there was something interesting and something telling about that sign right at the very start of our journey. We knew we'd be able to gather somewhere, but we knew that if we were going to really flourish and really grow, we'd need to be under a roof. We'd need to be in a place where not only we could gather, but where other people could find their home as well. So that little sign, "Save Our Church," was kind of nearly a hint towards where we were going to track. The thing is about what's so important about the renewal of the church, and in fact renewing the church, is it creates an environment where people themselves can encounter the Spirit, learn what it means to follow Jesus, and then themselves take that renewal to their workplace, to their school, to to their home, into their relationship. Because it's only renewed people that are enabled to renewed culture. What people need more than anything else is actually the presence of God in our lives. That's the very thing that gives our life energy, meaning, purpose, and focus, and it makes sense of the whole thing. And so that's why having a renewed church is so, so incredibly important, because it's actually the means through which, it's the environment through which people can encounter the Spirit, learn what it means to follow Jesus, and they themselves be transformed. And so, if you were part of kind of day one, you would recognize that, in fact, we've got, so many more kids here today. We've actually built something pretty significant here. And in fact, we've got all these amazing kids ministries. We've been growing and kind of adding on to that. And it's wonderful seeing our growing youth ministry as well. And all these things are super important. But again, they're just the environments into which God's Spirit can be poured into and people can encounter the person of Jesus. That's the main thing. And while the vision that God has for creation is, of course, the resurrection of Jesus, what we see in Jesus is not just one instance of resurrection. What we see is a picture of what God wants to do for all of creation. But not only is Jesus the vision of what God has for all of creation, it's also the means through which God's going to bring that about. It's through a renewed humanity, through renewed people empowered by the Spirit. That's the means through which God is going to renew the creation that He loves and He longs to see come fully alive. So it's two things. It's not only the vision, it's the means, and that's why the church is important, and that's why renewing the church is so very important also. And so today we stand at a real hinge point, really, because as a church, we've got to a certain point, and it's been really exciting to see what has grown here. And I want to put that in the context, in fact, how the church is going generally, the Anglican Church is going generally in New Zealand. We planted Saint Augustine's, and it's gone incredibly well, given the headwind or the context, the frame that we find ourselves in. If we can just flick to the slide. So currently today, this is the Anglican Church by the numbers as we currently speak. So in 2006, you can see how this graph goes, right? Between 2006 and 2018, the under 15s, there's been a decline in the percentage of the church. And what that has meant also is between 2006 and 2018, there's been an increase in the number of those who are aged 65. And so what we have is an aging church population. And these numbers, that's actually quite a steep slope. And although we don't have the numbers are just coming in, basically post-COVID, the slope that was looking like this is now looking like this, right? It's taken a real dive south. Now, what's so interesting against this is just the frame into which the St. Augustine story sits, but this is part of the story, if we can just flick to the next numbers. So while our under 15s, the Anglican Church generally has gone from 13 to 11 to 8%, St. Augustine's in 2018, this is our best numbers, was at 28.1%, and in 2024, our best numbers are 32.3%. Can you see the difference, right? Can you see what's going on here? This is what the renewal of the church is beginning to look like. It's actually all the lead indicators. A young church with, growing in terms of our children's church and growing numbers of youth. That's where the future of the church lies. And it's against this headwind that we've been able to establish what we have today. And I'm just incredibly grateful, I should say, for the faithfulness of every person who's given, every person who's prayed, and every person who's rolled up their flippin' sleeves to get this done. Because let me tell you, setting up and packing down this place that starts as a school, right, and ends up as a church, and then we resolve it back to a school, that takes some time and effort. So for every person who's been a part of this journey, a round of applause, please. Absolutely phenomenal. But here, as I said, we stand at a hinge point because we can continue to do this if we want to. We can continue to do this. But what I'm saying is there's something that lies beyond just doing this, right? This is really good, right? This is really good. Look at the numbers, right? This is actually quite good, what's happening here. But there's something that lies beyond this. And we've kind of been a part of these amazing discussions as we've grown here. We've got this environment happening with St. Barnabas, which has been absolutely amazing. We're thinking about what does it mean to be a part of renewing the parish of St. Barnabas, Mount Eden, and so that we can kind of launch out from there further into what God is calling us to do. And that is really the next step that is so important for us to take. St. Augustine's has always been about a great place for us, but not only that. We want to have it a great place for other people, where many others who are just curious about faith, questioning faith, who are just unsure about what all this God stuff is, where they can come and be curious and have their questions answered and just be a part of the discussion, right? No strings attached, no judgment, and so we need to take this next step. And this is a step of a shift, and we talked about this last year, the shift from turning of being inward and sorting out all our stuff here, which is important, not denying that, to a shift that's a bit more open and a bit more outward looking. And we've begun that journey with the marriage course we did at the start of this year. But we want to continue that into doing something like the Alpha course or creating an environment where people who don't know Jesus can come and have these questions answered and just come and experience something of what does it mean to reconnect with God. So that's the next step we need to be taking, and this is the point at which we need to make this decision. Because today, where our finances are at, we are enabled to do this, right? We can keep this party going, but if we want to step into this, This is going to take new resources, new finances, more prayer, and a greater kind of rolling up of the sleeves to get this done. So the question is, do we want to do this? And that's where we're at today. But we're at a hinge point, not only thinking about how do we live our life and what's next for us. Do you know, culturally, we're at a really, really, really interesting point in terms of Western culture, just generally. I'm just going to get rid of this. I can't do two things, hold one or the other, right? I'll pick it up. Don't worry, we'll follow the notes. To the letter. So we're in a really interesting point culturally. And what I mean by that is, there's this famous poem that was written in 1867 called Dover Beach. And it's a poem that was written by an English poet called Mathew. And he talked about in the Victorian era, there was kind of the rise of science, the rise of rationality. And it seemed to be just this real high point, an increasing involvement in technology in society. And what Mathew was seeing off in the distance really was as this rise of technology and science and rationality was kind of taking over some of the public discourse, the way we think about how life works, he envisaged also the decrease of the importance of the church and of Christianity in people's lives. And he talked about this in terms of the metaphor of like the tide coming in and going out. And he's like the metaphor was a person standing on Dover Beach seeing the sea of faith receding off into the distance. And what is so interesting about that is that it was kind of like not only was that true, and has it come true just in the West, by the way, this is just for Westerners, the rest of the world is just doing quite fine by itself, but just Westerners having a bit of a crisis. So just let us have our crisis, we're having a crisis. But it was actually not only because of the rise of kind of secularism and science and all that kind of stuff, but also kind of the church had a very, strange sense of self-importance, right? So the tide going out on the church was actually for other reasons, not just the rise of secularism. And I think justifiably so, a sense where its position in society just had an over kind of realized sense of its own importance. It is important, but it doesn't have to be the big thing. Actually, life beyond that is actually much bigger, right? And so so there was kind of nearly like a sense of judgment on the church as well as the tide started to go out. And what was interesting about that is that most of the questions that people answered when they were exploring faith were questions around how does Christianity line up with science? How does Christianity line up with secularism? Right? These were the big questions in people's minds. But at the same time, as we've kind of drifted away from that, and we're in a world filled with kind of like where science is going to provide the answers, where democracy is going to provide the answers, where technology is going to provide the answers, what people have found is post-COVID, people just kind of are losing faith in that story. People are really losing faith that will Western democracy be the big thing that helps everybody? Gosh, I'm just not sure any longer. Anyone else feeling that? Right? People have just lost their faith in that. It's just so much. People are wondering like, gosh, technology is great, but is it going to be a universal good? How good is the rate of our technological growth? How good is that for human beings? Big questions around that, right? And will that provide meaning and purpose and direction for our lives? There's kind of big questions around that now as we kind of launch out from, beyond the pandemic. And so it feels like we've had a great time partying hard with secularism, but the hangover is absolutely killing us, right? It seemed like a good time at the time, but now kind of Western culture is breaking up with secularism and is trying to find its way back home or trying to find something else. Interestingly, starved of kind of meaning and purpose and a sense of direction and hope, people are thinking like, gosh, what was it we left behind? And what that has meant has been a real shift post-COVID in some of the public questions around faith. No longer does it seem to mean like, if we answer the scientific questions, everything will be sorted. If we've got a great defense rationally, that'll help. People today seem to be asking these kinds of questions. How do I experience God? How do I experience it? Can you see there's just a big jump? People want to know God's goodness. People want to experience God. The conversation seems to be more around how do I engage with God? And what that has meant is kind of a real shift and a real openness to exploring how do I engage with God. And this has been noted and come much further to the fore in a couple of really public examples. And the first is a guy called Tom Holland. Tom Holland is a public academic. He's written this big as Ben-Hur book called Dominion. He's not a Christian. He was raised in a churchy family, but himself is not a Christian. Where's Tom Holland? Can we pop him up? Here he is. Here's Tom. And he's a cherry chap, isn't he? Tom Holland, Why I Was Wrong About Christianity. He wrote this big book around the influence of Christianity within Western democracy. But he himself was not a Christian, but he was thought, gosh, there's some real goodness here. And he became increasingly open to exploring this. During the pandemic, he was actually diagnosed with cancer. But because all the hospitals in the area, of course, were absolutely rammed to the gunnels with people with coronavirus and not knowing what to do with this, in the UK, it was an absolute nightmare. And so they kind of had a diagnosis right, but they couldn't figure out the prognosis. They knew he had cancer. They weren't exactly sure how bad it was. And so he, in desperation, went to the church just around the road. It's called St. Bartholomew's. Interestingly, he bumped into another interesting... anyway, he went to St. Bartholomew's. I'll leave that story a bit later. But and where basically he was going off to the hospital in a couple of weeks' time, but he found himself there in an evening service, in evensong, in a very high Anglican church. It's bells and smells and all the kinds of things. And he just prayed the most desperate prayer. He said, God, I don't know you, but if you're there, can you help me? Come on, help me. Amen, right? He was not an Anglican. But, I like the approach, right? Really plain, just cut straight to it. 2 weeks later, he went back to the hospital and they couldn't find the cancer, which is very interesting. And they did a number of range of other tests and they basically reversed the diagnosis. And the interesting thing here, you see, is it didn't solve all his rational questions. It didn't solve all his scientific questions. But he had the opportunity to engage in prayer with God. Now, Tom Holland, he's got the biggest podcast on Apple at the moment, right? He's a very public figure. And on the other, whatever thing, Spot or something or other. So who cares, right? He's a very, very public figure. And the thing is, he's basically saying, I don't really understand this. And he's exploring more about what this means. I want to have you another interesting figure. This person here, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She's probably one of the most well-known female atheists of the 21st century. She's got an absolutely amazing story, and a very sad story, in fact. She was Somalian. She was brought up in a very difficult, strident Islamic fundamentalist family, and she basically fled to Europe to escape a forced marriage. She then basically got involved in politics. She's very bright. She caned it in university. And she became part of the Dutch Parliament. She was also a human rights activist and also a great kind of... She's just a very, very smart, intelligent person. She basically then, she renounced her faith in Islam and actually renounced her faith completely in God altogether. And she wrote a book that went absolutely viral. It's called Infidel. It got her into lots of trouble. But then she basically found herself sharing the stage with a number of the new atheist movement. And she was on the stage, she was doing talks, she was doing book tours. But at the very same time, she found herself really struggling with depression. And she became an alcoholic. And her story descended into lots and lots of relational difficulties. And she went to counsellor after therapist after counsellor after therapist. And after firing a number of them, she finally got to one. And this counsellor said, look, I just don't know. But have you tried prayer? Have you tried praying? Would you give that a go? And she said, I can't in good conscience pray because I've rejected God. I've publicly rejected God. I can't be found praying now. And so she said she couldn't pray because also, not only she publicly rejected God, but also she said the God I grew up with was an absolute monster. And so the therapist said to her, what kind of God could you pray to? And she wrote up a list. And then as she was describing this kind of God that she could pray to, what she discovered is, in fact, she was describing the person of Jesus in the New Testament. And it completely revolutionized her. She began going to church, began wanting to discover more and more what it was. But even en route, what she found is she found this deep contact and connection, this very healing presence of Jesus as she prayed. And then basically last year, she came out with this article, Why I Am Now a Christian. The article went absolutely, wild across the internet. But it just wants to I just want to show you the difference and the change that is happening within our culture today. Whereas before, Christianity was associated with Ned Flanders, and probably rightly so, right? Now there's a real openness to discover actually what's right at the heart of this, what's at the bottom here. Is God available? Is God right? Is God true? What difference does that make in our life? It seems like Western culture, like the prodigal son, had cashed in its inheritance and went and spent it on modernity and had a great time. But at the very end of that, has found itself hungry, starved of meaning, lacking purpose and direction, and no sense of power in its life, and has begun a search and a turn back home. A search and a turn towards the one who, right at the very heart of all things. And we want to be a place that is safe enough and kind enough and open enough that people can come and have these questions surface in a super non-judgmental way, in a way that basically has no strings attached. But here's the thing, not only is this happening overseas, this is actually part of the New Zealand story, and this is happening here today as well. We often, in a place like this, we forget the power of the gospel to really transform lives. Today, I'm really honoured, as I mentioned at the start, we've been having these great discussions with St. Barnabas, this wonderful church in Mount Eden, and we're talking about the possibility of being part of renewing that church. And it's a real pleasure to have Scott Malcom here today. He's the vicar of St. Barnabas, and he's got an amazing story about the way that God has transformed his life. So I would like us all to give Scott Malcom a really warm St. Augustine's welcome. Come on up, mate.
So this is me. Thank you. It's a privilege and an honour, really, just to be here. Newt asked me to talk a little bit about my story. The thing is that this effectively is really not my story, it's our story. For Tom Holland, for the young woman whose name I can't pronounce, who was an atheist, for all of us, for every single one of us who have heard the good news of Jesus and met him, and he has proved to be far more than we could ever hope for. This is our story. And I have to tell you, it is by far the very best thing that has ever happened. This story starts at a time before a lot of you were born, 1980, and it's a foreign planet. Ronald Reagan's just become the President of the United States. John Lennon gets murdered this year. There are no cell phones, there is no internet, personal computers are barely a blip on the landscape. Electricity is for cooking your toast, not for driving your car or your scooter or your bike. There's no streaming. There's no Facebook, there's no Instagram, there's no TikTok, there's no YouTube. TV comes in 3 channels, and you can only just begin to record it on video. Music comes in 3 ways too. Comes on vinyl, comes in a cassette tape, and you listen to it on the radio. The big bands are Michael Jackson, Queen, and Blondie, depending on your musical taste. It costs a month's wages to get across the ditch, but everybody can still afford to buy a house. Here in New Zealand, Robert Muldoon is the Prime Minister, and the country's going down the toilet. Funnily enough, in spite of the expense, everybody is leaving to go to Australia. They coined a phrase, the last one out, turn off the light. Me, I'm 20. I'm a shade under 120 kilograms. I ride a large motorcycle, got a pierced ear, hair down to the middle of my back. I have a reputation in the local community where I live, which is not something that you would put on your CV if you were going for a job. That was partly my own doing, but partly also because my stepfather was an ex-New Zealand boxing champion. He was an ex-welterweight champion, and so, that added to a little bit to kind of what it was about. I'm living with Janet, who's my girlfriend, who's still, after 45 years, now my wife, and she's the second best thing, the other best thing that happened to me. We live in a tiny seaside town called Ruakaka, and I am a local drug dealer. I've been on the dole for about 3 months, and I get a phone call from the Labour Department who, back in those days, organised work for people who were unemployed, and they had what was called a PEP scheme, and they wanted to put me to work at the local power station, Marsden A, the power station at Ruakaka. Now, I thought it was a great idea because Janet's brother Peter, he worked there. He was working in the village gang, so my kind of vision of my next little 6 months of work would be I get stoned all day, every day, and I'd ride around cutting grass on a ride-on lawnmower. I thought it would be a great thing to do. So I turned up for work on the first day, and the boss came out of the office and he said to me, "Scott, you're not going to be working in the village gang. You're going to be working in the garden with Ray Brown." Now, you've got to know that Ruakaka even today is not a very big place, but in 1980, it was a lot smaller. My parents owned a business under the local Workingmen's Club, which, if you know anything about small town New Zealand, was one of the 2 watering holes in the whole district. I knew every single person that lived in that area. "Ray Brown," I said, "he's a Christian, isn't he?" And the boss took a step back, he went pale, and he said to me, "That's not going to be a problem, is it?" And I said, "No. Christians are supposed to be good people." We walked out of the office, and the power station is quite a big place. There's a big tarmacked area. Come out walking up towards the garden shed and to where all of that kind of stuff was. And this man comes out of the garden compound and starts walking towards us. As soon as I laid eyes on him, I knew that he was different to anybody else that I had ever met. Ray'd been away to the Second World War. He'd enlisted and lied about his age, so he went away. He was 17. Came back, and he's a wreck. Became a drunk. He was a kind of guy who'd drink a bottle of whiskey and a dozen bottles of beer a day. Then one day, from work, a woman asked him to attend church. He went. Sunday night at the local Baptist church, an appeal was given to give your life to Jesus. Ray got up out of his chair and he walked forward. From that moment, he was a new man. Went into the garden shed, showed me around, asked me home for lunch. Now, the other thing perhaps that you need to understand is that that's not something very many people would have done, to ask me home for lunch. We went to his place, I met his wife, we sat down at the table and he said, in this house we say grace. So I don't know where I got it from, but I bowed my head and he started to pray. As he prayed, I knew that there was somebody else in the room with us. Over the next few weeks, he talked to me about what had happened to him, told me about his life, about all the things that had gone on. And as he would talk to me about how Jesus had made an impact on his life and what had happened when he'd gone forward at that local little Baptist church, I don't know how, and I couldn't explain what it was, but I could see the Holy Spirit falling on him. It was just the most amazing thing. My life was a shambles. I was stoned most of the time. I had the local policeman take far too much interest in my affairs. I had a large cannabis crop that was stolen. I wasn't getting on with Janet. I'd tried all of the conventional young person things, the things that young people think are going to make them happy. I'd had my trip to Australia. I went twice. I came back. I was profoundly empty. Then one day, I thought I'd take a risk. After talking with Ray, I walked into the back of the garden shed and I looked up at the ceiling and I prayed. I said, Lord, I've had control of my life for 20 years. I haven't really been able to do much with it. You're welcome to the rest of it if you can do anything with it. Nothing happened. Went home, saw Janet and said, I've become a Christian. Janet said, I'll become one too. As you can imagine, it wasn't a particularly easy ride those first couple of months. We tried to do everything right. We moved into separate bedrooms. We tried really hard to do everything right. But the big thing, I couldn't give up. I couldn't give up the drugs. I love the Lord Jesus, but I love smoking weed. Just as much. And let me say, just to anybody who's listening, smoking weed and reading the Bible, it's not a good idea. It's not a good idea. So this kind of thing went on for about a month until one day I came home from work. I went into my bedroom. I knelt down by my bed and I started to weep. And it just rushed out of me. Now, I don't know how long I was there, but I heard Janet come home from work. I heard the sliding door in the little flat where we were living, and she came home. I walked out of the bedroom and into the lounge, and I gave her a hug. And as she walked off to go into the kitchen, again, I looked up to heaven and I prayed. And I said, Lord, I give up smoking. And I felt a hand reach down out of heaven and grab a knot above my head, about 1 meter above my head, and just go whack. And it hit me so hard, I physically straightened up. That moment utterly and completely changed my life. From that moment, it was done. Completely done. I went to work the next morning, and one of the little jobs that we had was to rake waste over the village. Was a separate kind of unit, and it had its own sewage treatment plant. And one of our jobs, Ray got because he was the Christian, was to go there and to rake up the stuff that was all dried in little piles and bag it up and get rid of it. So this morning, this was our job. We were there raking stuff up, and I said to Ray, I told him what had happened. And as you can imagine, he'd poured his heart and his soul into me, and so he was quite happy. And he started to cry. And he cried for a few minutes, and then not a few minutes, he cried for a bit, and then he stopped. And he just looked at me. And then for just about 5 seconds, he just stared at me. And then he said to me, Scott, and look, this is, hair down, ear, He said, he looked at me and he said, Scott, one day I believe you'll be a Baptist minister. From the moment those words came out of his mouth till now, standing here in front of all of you, it is the only thing that I have ever felt right about doing. In January, Newt and Steve came to St Barnabas, and they said to me, what do you think about joining up with St Augustine's? And I said, why not? I said, why not? Because it was the right thing to do. I said, why not? Because after banging away for 35 years, I thought that perhaps the Lord was giving this opportunity so that the things that I had prayed for might come to fruition. And even at my ridiculous age, I'm in. I said, why not? Because I hope to see other people get the opportunity that we have all had of meeting the real Jesus, the Jesus who loves and cares for them, the Jesus who will be for them what we have found, which is so much more than they could ever expect. The Jesus who has given us the opportunity, me the opportunity, to be free. As you consider gearing up for Alpha and all of the other things that you are going to do, all of God's mighty power to your arm, because it is the very best thing that's ever happened. Amen.
It's for stories like Scott that we really want to take this next step into where we want to go as a church. Thank you, Scott, so much for sharing that with us, and for Janet for being so amazing and helping this guy through. Clearly, you've been an absolute superstar. So a real diamond in the rough, but a diamond nonetheless. So we're super grateful for you guys being here today. But in seriousness, why I wanted to fold this in is because, it does take a real shift, and it does take a real step. And like what I was saying before, we've kind of got enough. If we continue on the way we're going today, we're going to be fine. We're going to be great. If we just have a small increase across all our APs, we're going to land right at the dead center of our budget, and hooray, we get to do exactly what we're doing today, right? Which, as I said, is good, right? There's nothing not good about it. But if we want to see more stories like Scott's, if we want to hear more stories like the ones that I've talked about today, we actually need to have an increase in the resource base in order to make that work. We need more people praying, we need more people giving, we need more finance in the tank, and we need more people to roll up their sleeves to make it happen. And so where we stand today is we are, if we need a kind of 10% increase and across all our APs, which is absolutely amazing, and that would kind of get us a certain way down the track. But if we could actually have an injection into the bloodstream of some one-off gifts and some real increase, that'll give us the confidence to actually jump into this next move with a real sense of like God's with us, with a real sense of just kind of clarity and with real confidence. Having those resources in the bank and ready to go will just be great fuel to the fire for our next move. Yes, we've got St. Barnabas, we're thinking about all of that, but the key around this is not so much what's good for us. We're thinking about those people beyond us and creating an environment in which they can come, which they can have some of their questions raised, where they can come and experience the Spirit. And that's what we're wanting to do next. But again, we're in a position where we need extra to make that happen. So in our usual way, we kind of give out the vision of where we want to go. My job is just to say, hey, what I think we want to do next. But it's us to, really it is up to us to kind of think, ask God, how should I respond to that? What can I do? What's responsible to do? And it's best to ask your spouse if you're on an AP before you do that. But we want to just take a moment because we also want to ask God, what are you saying to me? What are you saying to us today? How do you want me to respond? So in a moment, we're going to hand out some cards. We're going to get all the admin done. But we want to take this seriously. Let's just pause now, just for a moment. Give yourself 30 seconds. Close your eyes and say, God, how do you want me to respond to this today? We're at this hinge point. Lord, lead me and guide me in what to do next. So that's what we're going to do. Someone's got a timer. Anyone got a timer? Mary's got a timer. A minute? Let's go for a minute. Let's just pause, ask God, Holy Spirit, guide me in what we should be doing next.